we are continuing our journey through the book of Joshua, and there's an issue throughout this book, and a fair bit of the Old Testament really, that looms large for modern readers that we touched on in the Jericho sermon, and we're going to go back to again today, sort of as the focal point actually, and that's the morality of holy war, the mission that God sent Israel on to destroy the Canaanites. And this is often considered one of the stronger attacks on biblical faith by secular people. Basically, the question of how could a loving God, how could a good God do these things, cause this kind of devastation? And many people are not going to find the answer to that question either easy or, even more so, emotionally satisfying. And that's believer and non-believer alike. But there is an answer. And what it really boils down to is that God is our creator and he is just. And so these are the sort of things that come about because of who he is. If we want hope, if we want to overcome this type of suffering, then that requires on his mercy received on his terms. That's what's necessary. And so that's what we're going to discover using Joshua chapter 10 and chapter 11 as an example that we can learn from for that. And so that's where we'll be today. If you happen to put your handout in your Bible last week, then you're able to open right back up to it because we're just following right from verse 16. We stopped with verse 15 last time. But if you haven't, go ahead and do that now, or you can grab a paper Bible over off the shelf or just search for Joshua chapter 10, verse 16, which says, "These 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in a cave at Makkedah. And it was told Joshua, saying, the 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave at Makkedah. So Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave, and set men by it to guard them. And do not stay there yourselves, but pursue your enemies and attack their rear guard. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for the Lord your God has delivered them into your hand. Then it happened, while Joshua and the children of Israel made an end of slaying them with a very great slaughter till they had finished, that those who escaped entered fortified cities. And all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace. No one moved his tongue against any of the children of Israel. Then Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave and bring out those 5 kings to me from the cave. And they did so, and brought out those 5 kings to him from the cave. The king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. And so it was, when they brought out those kings to Joshua, that Joshua called for all the men of Israel, and said to the captains of the men of war who went with him, come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings. And they drew near and put their feet on their necks. And Joshua said to them, do not be afraid, nor be dismayed. Be strong and of good courage, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight. And afterward Joshua struck them and killed them and hanged them on 5 trees. And they were hanging on the trees until evening. And so it was at the time of the going down of the sun that Joshua commanded, and they took them down from the trees, cast them into the cave where they had been hidden, and laid large stones against the cave's mouth, which remain until this day. So verse 16, like I said, this goes back to last week, the battle where the sun stood still. This is finishing that up. May even all have taken place on the same day, or at least very shortly after that, as Joshua and the Israelites pressed the advantage. The enemy had been beaten. He wanted them destroyed. And so he tells them, prevent the fleeing enemy from getting away, from being able to enter their fortifications. Now, some of them still did. They weren't able to get absolutely everybody, but they got enough to weaken the Canaanites desperately. They might be able to stay hidden inside their towns, but they're not going to be able to come out and threaten the Israelites anymore. So it's a very successful result, especially by being able to capture the kings themselves, the instigators behind all of this, who caused the battle in the first place, only to run away and hide. Now, no direct attention in Scripture is actually brought to their cowardice, but it's obvious enough that that's what they were. And they caused all of this, but they weren't willing to face the music. Or at least we're hoping they wouldn't have to, but their choices did have consequences, and that's what they are forced to deal with, is they are dragged out of that cave. And we're not told what their reaction was, so we have to imagine it. But there are as many options as there were kings, at the very least. Because maybe, as they were being pulled out, they tried to fight back. Don't know if they still had their swords or anything left, and so maybe they were swinging around trying to see if they could protect themselves. Or maybe, even if they were being brought to Joshua, they were denying the reality of their situation and thinking that just over the horizon, a group of their cavalry would show up and would come and sweep them away to safety. Or maybe they thought, well, we have money, and so they tried to beg and bargain for their release, to offer to pay a ransom so Joshua could let them go. Perhaps they didn't say anything. And if they didn't, that could be because they were just dumbstruck in terror. Or, to go the complete opposite direction, they might have just been stoic and defiant to the very end. We don't know. It could have been one of these things. It could have been all of these things. They could have been experiencing them in a mixture. It didn't matter because nothing that they did was going to help them. Their time had come as Joshua made his message clear. Although to us, maybe it's not too clear because we look at this situation and wonder, what did the Israelites have to be afraid of after the battle is over for Joshua to tell them to be courageous and not to be dismayed? For one thing, at least in general, that's a call back to chapter 1 and what we keep coming back to in this book, that God told Joshua not to be afraid so he could tell the Israelites not to be afraid, so he could lead them in courage. And so this is an extension of that, but I do think it's also a little bit more specific to this situation itself, because it's quite the thing to have been able to do, to capture and kill these 5 kings. It's something amazing that they accomplished. But in the ancient world, royalty were considered basically semi-divine. They were called and established by their gods if they weren't even descended from their gods. That at least was what the Egyptians believed, and that was where the Israelites had come from, was Egypt. And so they are in this cultural context, even though it's not what they are supposed to believe. And so there might have been some fear, well, we're just commoners. If we undertake to stand on these guys, are we going to be inviting some type of divine retribution against ourselves? That's actually why Joshua was telling them to do it, to be a reminder that they're not going to face any type of consequences because they are serving, they are obeying the only God that there actually is. And so he's the only God to actually be afraid of, the fearless one on whom they could and should rely, that no one can defeat. And so that was Joshua's message to them, but the message to the Canaanites certainly is clear enough. Anybody can understand that. They are literally being placed underfoot. And it's the same thing that is promised to the Messiah in Psalm 110, verse 1, where it says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool." That is the fate of all of God's enemies. And so, of course, that is also the promise that's made to all of God's people, is that we will share in this victory. And so the experience of Joshua and the children of Israel is pointing forward to the greater Joshua, to Jesus, the Lord's salvation, and what he is going to do for his people. But in any case, the rest of chapter 10 moves pretty quickly. There's no battles that are described through the remainder of it. There's just a list of cities that are captured by the Israelites as the southern half of the promised land is subdued. And in verse 40 there, it's mentioned that Joshua left none remaining but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel had commanded. So again, it's just there is a brutality here that we have to come to terms with. And then it continues into chapter 11 as well, where we'll return to reading. Chapter 11 at verse 1. It says, "It came to pass when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard these things, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, to the king of Shimron, to the king of Achshaph, and to the kings who were from the north in the mountains, in the plain south of Chinneroth, in the lowland, and in the heights of Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and in the west, the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite in the mountains, and the Hivite below Hermon in the land of Mizpah. So they went out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore in multitude, with very many horses and chariots. And when all these kings had met together, they came and camped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. But the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow about this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua and all the people of war with him came against them suddenly by the waters of Merom, and they attacked them. And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who defeated them and chased them to greater Sidon, to the brook Misrapoth, and to the valley of Mizpah eastward. They attacked them until they left none of them remaining. So Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Joshua turned back at that time and took Hazor and struck its king with the sword, for Hazor was formerly the head of all those kingdoms. And they struck all the people who were in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was none left breathing. Then he burned Hazor with fire. So all the cities of those kings and all their kings Joshua took and struck with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed them, as Moses the servant of the Lord had commanded. But as for the cities that stood on their mounds, Israel burned none of them except Hazor only, which Joshua burned. All the spoil of the cities and the livestock the children of Israel took as booty for themselves. But they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they left none breathing. As the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Chapter 11 starts with what we've seen before. This is the forming of a coalition. That had previously was the southern Canaanites. Now the groups that are described here are the northern Canaanites. And they put together an even more impressive army, but it goes as well as the previous Canaanites' army had, because Joshua still doesn't have to be afraid. The Lord continues to confirm his promises. As Israel obeyed him, he gave victory to Israel. So it didn't matter what they were up against. Their enemies were as good as dead. Hazor especially. That was the city that had drawn the allies together and led the fight. So that was the city that was burned to the ground like Jericho and Ai had been previously, where all of the others were taken over as places for the Israelites to then settle. And so they used what was already in place. As for verses 6 and 9, they kind of give us a curious detail here. Figured would explain a little bit just to help understand it, with the hamstringing of the horses and then burning the chariots. You know, why that's mentioned, God commanded it, and then why Joshua did it. Hamstringing a horse, the basic process just makes it so it can't run. So it does still continue to have some uses, particularly for agriculture, but it's not going to be able to pull a chariot anymore. And then actually destroying the chariots, we can look at that and think, why would you do something to something that is that valuable? But that was actually the point, is that God didn't want the Israelites to start depending on them the way that the Canaanites did. He wanted them to be courageous, which meant having faith in him to give them victory in battle, not depending on strength of arms, as though that would be their source of victory. So this goes right back to having to tell Joshua again not to be afraid. We can look at that and think, why does Joshua still have to be told this after all this time? But no, he continually does, because he needs to continually to remember what can actually overcome his fear. And that's how this all connects, because overconfidence can be just as bad as cowardice, as anxiety. Anxiety is kind of the obvious one that we think of here, and look at this and basically being too afraid to trust God to do what he says he's going to do, and so we do nothing. But overconfidence is the same belief. We don't believe God for what he says he's going to do, so we do it ourselves. And that's just as much a mistake, and that's what God does not want. So no, he doesn't condemn us for constantly returning to him for assurance. That's what we're supposed to do. He's frustrated if we refuse to believe him when he actually gives assurance, one way or another. That's what we want to avoid. So we do want to be like Joshua here, who believed the Lord and then did everything that he told him to do. But now there are a few more details as we drive to the focal point that I said we wanted to look at here today. So we go back to Joshua 11, now at verse 16. It says, "Thus Joshua took all this land, the mountain country, all the south, all the land of Goshen, the lowland and the Jordan plain, the mountains of Israel and its lowlands, from Mount Halak and the ascent to Seir, even as far as Baal Gad and the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings and struck them down and killed them. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. There was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All the others they took in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, that he might utterly destroy them, and that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them as the Lord had commanded Moses. And at that time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah and all the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had said to Moses. And Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Then the land rested from war. So south and north, that's what this is going over. The whole land was conquered and the inhabitants were destroyed. This is a summary, although it does get interrupted by the closer look at these Anakim, these people that are mentioned specifically in this passage. The reason they're mentioned specifically is because they were especially large and fierce warriors. And that's what they were known for, was their size and their power. And that's actually why the 10 unfaithful spies from the mission that Moses sent them on 40 years previous to this point in time, they came back and called these people giants. Now, that was dishonest, because giant actually means something a little bit different to us than it did to them. When we think that, we think of somebody who's tall, which these people certainly were. Actually, eventually, Goliath would be descended from these. He'd come from Gath, one of those last cities that's mentioned here. But it wasn't really about their size. A giant, for the Old Testament terminology, is really about having superhuman power. And so that was what these spies came back and lied and told everybody else in order to scare them, so that they wouldn't be willing to go in and then conquer the land like God had commanded them to, which of course resulted in God saying you're never allowed to go in, and an entire generation was wiped out. So now it is their faithful children who do drive out the Anakim, who trusted the faithfulness of God in order to be able to do so. And so that's why this is used as the ultimate example. It's the ultimate statement of how unstoppable the Lord was. So that's the point of it. But again, all of this goes together. It's part of this war, and so we do want to step back and look at the whole. Because we're told here that it was God who made all of this happen, that he hardened the Canaanites' hearts in order to draw them into destruction, wiped out entire populations, and left nothing breathing. So we have that question: how is this fair? First off, I do want to explain some context, because you could say that it softens the blow a little bit on this. Not everything was actually destroyed. At the very least, we're told that livestock was taken, and they were breathing, and so not literally everything that was breathing was killed. And there's also passages elsewhere, especially in the book of Judges, that say that there were human survivors to these battles too, and that there were pockets of Canaanite resistance that continued to exist for a very long time. It is actually only in the story of Jericho that we're specifically, explicitly told that all people, men and women, young and old, were killed during the conquest. Everywhere else, for as harsh as the language is, it's actually a little bit more ambiguous than that. And then you have verse 14 here in chapter 11 that suggests the solution that it was the men, it was the soldiers who were the ones who were wiped out during the fighting everywhere else. So, and I do think that this is actually, again, based on the evidence that's presented, that was what happened. It didn't go as far as maybe the way that this is written would suggest to us. That's the historical detail. As far as making the argument, it doesn't matter. If we just go ahead and stipulate that this is the worst version of it that we can make, it's still, from a biblical perspective, perfectly fair. Because like we've talked about before, fairness is a result of looking at things from God's perspective. That he is the one who's established the difference between right and wrong and holds people accountable to it. That was why he sent the Israelites. So what he actually says on multiple occasions, starting with Abraham, hundreds of years before all of this, that he was going to be sending the Israelites in order to punish the Canaanites for their sins. And then actually in Leviticus, places like Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, those sins are described. And those are the places where we get descriptions of the type of sexual sins and the idolatry and the idolatrous practices that the Israelites were told that they were not supposed to engage in, because those were the sorts of things that the Canaanites did, and that was why God was going to wipe them out. Actually, that kind of matters too, just when it comes to our era, where people basically argue in favor of open sexuality of any sort, sexual revolution, and they'll try to even point to Scripture in an odd way and say that those passages were only intended specifically for the Israelites, and so they don't really hold anymore, and they don't have any permanent moral meaning. But that doesn't make sense, because those chapters actually say that was why God was punishing the Canaanites, and they didn't have a relationship with him the way the Israelites did. He was still holding them accountable. So those things do continue to be sins, but that's the point. Sin. Because that's one of the other things that's occasionally argued, a little bit more than occasionally, is that this was about ethnicity. That it's because these people were not Israelites that God wanted a genocide carried out against them. And that was the idea, was to wipe them out on the basis of their blood. But again, that's got nothing to do with it, which is made obvious by how often God would go on to do these things to the Israelites, to punish them for their sins. Because again, he holds people accountable. All human beings are God's creations. And so when they defy him, they can expect consequences. And also, he knows better than we do what everyone is capable of, even when it comes to future generations. And so that would be the other reason why he would be justified in destroying the Canaanites, is because he didn't want them staying there as a poison, as a rot in the heart of Israel that would guide them into those sins that God was punishing the Canaanites for. And so that was why he wanted this war prosecuted to the ultimate extent. And he has the right to demand that, and he is right to demand that. If he says what the law is and people break the law, then they can expect to be punished. That's just the truth, as hard as it can be to swallow, which, like we talked about at Jericho, it's hard to swallow because we know who we are. And we don't want that accountability, but it doesn't make it any less true. So what is more shocking is really not that God does these things that we see recorded here. It's really that he lets us continue at all. That he's merciful enough to give us time to recognize that we have done things wrong, that we have sinned against him, and that we need his mercy. That's the truly amazing thing when we actually stop to think about it. But now I do want to kind of change the angle on this a little bit, and I guess kind of talk directly to, even though not necessarily anybody in the usual viewers of these messages who would kind of have this mindset, but who knows? You know, maybe somebody is, or you don't know where things go on the internet. Somebody may eventually come across this, and so I want to talk directly to somebody who would make this argument and would say that these passages prove that God is not loving and is not good if he could do these sorts of things, and so I'd rather not believe in him at all, because again, that's the argument that's made. And so I think there's actually a more difficult question that they have to deal with. So my question to you would be, why does it matter? And not why does it bother you? Because it bothers you because you're an empathetic person and you see these people suffering and you don't like the idea of that. I don't like the idea of it either. But that's not the question. It's why does it matter? Asked another way, if there is no God, why should anyone care about any of this? What does it mean? The Israelites just took what they wanted. They did what they wanted to. And yes, they justified themselves by saying that their God told them to do it, but if there is no God, of course, he didn't actually do that. And they didn't even need to bother to justify it at all. They could have just done it with no excuse because it was neither right nor wrong. Amen. If you are correct about there not being a God. Because if there isn't one, then all we have is a purely material universe. It's just physical. There's nothing else to it other than that. And in that type of world, the destruction of Canaan was no more morally meaningful than jaywalking, because meaning's impossible, if you're correct. So if you bristle at the idea of what God did here and you charge him with wrongdoing, you're actually admitting that wrong can be done, which doesn't fit inside of your worldview. You're saying that there is, in fact, a moral standard, but a moral standard is metaphysical, which means it's beyond nature. So it's just another way of saying supernatural. Metaphysical just happens to be the kind of the more philosophical term that gets used, but that's what it is. It's a concept that cannot be explained out of the physical stuff of the universe. And so it requires a metaphysical source, something beyond nature. And also, it is an intellectual concept. Morality, therefore, requires an intellect in order to form it. That is the only explanation of why we have it in the world at all. And so either there is purpose or there is not. You can't have it both ways. You can't try to say at the same time that, well, there's no God, and so I don't have to be afraid of anything, but then also say what these people did in the name of God was wrong. Those things can't both be true. They contradict each other. So it's time to come to terms with what you actually believe, which is what there is a difference between right and wrong, and what is obvious. There is that difference between right and wrong. That means that it comes from a source, and that source of morality knows better than you do. And you are accountable to him. And no fighting, no excuses, no denials, no bargaining are going to get you out of that accountability any more than it did the 5 kings of Canaan. And you're not going to be able to hide any more successfully than they did. But you can be forgiven. And that's the point. These kings, Canaan itself, with all their sins, they ran out of time. And so God wasn't willing to give them anymore, and that's why they were undone. That's why they were sealed in their caves after their deaths, so that they could be locked behind there and forgotten. And your actions against God's will do not deserve any better than that. If he were being fair, that's what you would get. But he extends mercy, because Jesus, who did deserve no punishment, took yours in your place. And he was also, in death, sealed behind the stone, but it rolled away. His resurrection is the ultimate proof that he is in the right. So that means that faith in him is the only way to win the war. Now, you may not want to hear this harsh truth, and I realize the things I've been saying are harsh, but I do have to tell people because they are true. And your objections to them are not about right and wrong, they're excuses. So I hope that you'll surrender before it's too late. That you will see in these harsh and horrible things what God could do to you, so that you can instead recognize and thank him for what he's actually done, for the mercy and the love for you that he has shown, and accept them by trusting in Christ for your forgiveness, which you need, so that you will be saved. The alternative, don't think he's unfair if you don't take that. That's not on him. That's on you. But now Christians, again, these are hard questions for us to answer. I'm not going to pretend that they are easy, like I said, but don't be afraid of them. I tell you that just like Joshua told the captains of Israel when he had them execute those kings, to stand on their necks. We aren't fighting Israel's war, so we don't do it the same way, but still we have a battle, and it is against the message of death, and it's under our feet. The battle's already won. So arm yourself with the truth and share it. Jesus is alive. That's the basic. Again, philosophical concepts and things, they're important to know. You have to have people with the expertise that share them and work through them. But just the absolute thing that every Christian can tell is that Christ is alive and he will deliver on his promise to give us a home. And that's what everyone needs to know, so that they can remain among the living.